Well, less than 2 weeks away from the deadline to get tariffs off steel and aluminum, U.S. President Donald Trump targets another metal.
Came out. Now, today we're doing copper. I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
With less than 2 weeks to go before Canada's July 21st deadline for a trade deal, President Trump has opened another front. This time, it's copper. In a surprise announcement, he confirmed that the U.S. will impose a 50% tariff on copper imports, adding it to a growing list of metals already hit with national security duties under Section 232. Steel, aluminum, lumber, and now copper. This escalation isn't just about trade, it's about leverage. And once again, Canada finds itself caught in the crossfire of a strategy aimed primarily at China, but felt by America's closest allies.
Canada produces a good amount of copper, but ships a lot of it off to Asia for processing, and then it goes into the United States. Nonetheless, this is definitely going to hurt some sectors of the Canadian economy, and probably might delay us a little bit on reaching our own deal with the U.S.
This copper tariff fits a familiar pattern in Trump's second term. Pressure first, negotiation later. Over the past month, his administration has sent tariff letters to over a dozen countries: Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and others. The message is the same: strike a deal or face steep tariffs on August 1st. Copper broadens Trump's metal war. It's critical to infrastructure, used in data centers, electric grids, vehicles, and homes. Hitting it with a 50% tariff signals a shift from targeted protection to broad economic reshaping. For Canada, the fallout is real. Prices surge, supply chains are disrupted, and investor confidence takes a hit. Even if not the direct target, Canadian sectors feel the ripple effect. While Canada isn't the biggest supplier of copper to the US, it's a key player in the global copper ecosystem. Much of its production is refined in Asia before entering US markets. That means Canadian exports, though indirect, get swept up in the tariff net. This isn't just a paperwork problem. The sectors that rely on copper, energy, automotive, telecommunications, are all deeply integrated between the US and Canada. When one piece of that chain gets taxed, the rest slows down. Canada had already made major concessions. On June 30th, the Carney government officially dropped its digital services tax, a policy estimated to bring in over $1 billion Canadian dollars annually. The move was designed to reopen stalled trade talks with Washington. And for a moment, it worked. Negotiators were back at the table. But Trump didn't reciprocate. Instead of easing tensions, his team expanded them. Copper tariffs followed, along with threats of 200% duties on pharmaceuticals. Canada now faces a dilemma: give more ground or stand firm. Behind closed doors, Canada has reportedly floated a national security and defense pact with the US, a way to secure long-term tariff exemptions under Section 232. But there's no sign yet that the White House is willing to make that kind of deal. Canada's internal deadline is firm, July 21st. If there's no deal by then, Ottawa plans to reimpose retaliatory tariffs on American steel and other goods. The US deadline is August 1st, giving Trump the upper hand in timing. But this extra time hasn't brought clarity. Trump's trade team operates on a zero-sum logic. In their view, there's no room for balanced compromise, only victory. Even Japan and South Korea, who offered major purchases and subsidies, were still hit with tariffs. Canada, by contrast, has avoided public escalation. Prime Minister Mark Carney has kept negotiations out of the media spotlight, signaling stability. But the pressure is mounting, and Ottawa's options are shrinking.
But I would also point out that when it comes to Trump world, nothing is really final until it's final. Just look at the way that he's been characterizing a lot of these talks.
What started as a copper tariff could derail a bilateral trade reset. The longer this standoff drags, the harder it becomes to return to the USMCA framework both sides once agreed to. Canada isn't backing down, but neither is Trump. With deadlines approaching, this isn't just about metal. It's about the future of North American trade and whether pressure can replace partnership.
We're going to start sending letters out to various countries starting tomorrow, and they'll range in value from maybe 60 or 70% tariffs to 10 and 20% tariffs.
On July 4th, while Americans celebrated their independence with fireworks and parades, President Donald Trump took a different approach. From the East Room of the White House, he launched the next phase of his global trade campaign, announcing that letters would be sent to countries around the world, laying out new U.S. tariff rates ranging from 10% all the way up to 70%. These tariffs, he said, would go into effect on August 1st. The message was clear: sign a deal or face the cost. With agreements already reached with Vietnam and the United Kingdom, Trump felt vindicated. But one country, just across the northern border, remains locked in an unusually tense standoff: Canada. And unlike the others this time, Trump's strategy may hit a wall.
Trump says he plans to spend part of his 4th of July holiday sending letters to countries notifying them of their new tariff rates.
We have a lot of great things going, and we're getting along with countries, but some will be disappointed because they're going to have to pay tariff.
Trump's 90 deals in 90 days campaign has picked up pace. The UK locked in a mini deal. Vietnam accepted a revised tariff schedule. According to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, around 100 countries could qualify for a 10% base rate if they reach terms fast. But Canada is taking a different approach. Rather than rushing into a deal, Ottawa has reopened negotiations carefully, and only after withdrawing its digital services tax to get back to the table. Even so, no agreement has been announced. What's different this time is that Canada, unlike others, seems willing to push back.
Americans are celebrating their country's past and present today on Independence Day, while Canadians are expressing concerns about what the future could hold for the Canada-U.S. relationship.
For months, trade talks between the U.S. and Canada had stalled. In late June, Trump abruptly walked away from the table after Canada moved ahead with its digital services tax, a 3% levy targeting U.S. tech giants. Days later, under pressure, Prime Minister Mark Carney repealed the tax to reopen negotiations. But the concessions stopped there. Unlike other nations, Canada hasn't rushed to finalize a new deal. Instead, it has taken a quieter, slower approach, reopening discussions but refusing to give in to every demand. That includes Trump's likely next target, Canada's dairy sector. Canada's supply management system, which uses quotas and tariffs to protect domestic milk producers, has long been a sore point for Trump. But for Canadian policymakers, it's a non-negotiable pillar of economic sovereignty. Reforms would require political capital, cross-provincial consensus, and potentially an act of parliament. Though dairy was not officially raised, the idea of including it in the talks has triggered political backlash in Canada. And so far, Carney has not signaled any willingness to make concessions. This resistance is more than symbolic. If no agreement is reached by the July 21st deadline, Canada could face tariffs as high as 70% on its steel, aluminum, and auto exports, sectors deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains. The risk here is mutual. According to Statistics Canada, over 75% of Canadian automotive exports, roughly 80 billion Canadian dollars per year, go directly to the United States. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers rely heavily on Canadian inputs, especially in the Great Lakes region. Trump's escalating tactics may spark retaliation, not just diplomatically, but economically. If the U.S. imposes sweeping tariffs on Canada, it could disrupt cross-border supply chains, increase prices for U.S. consumers, and trigger political blowback in Midwestern states.
I think the reality is we're dealing with a president who is incredibly abnormal and not something we're used to.
Trump's tariff-first strategy has delivered quick deals in some cases. But with Canada, the calculus is different. This is not a developing economy adjusting its terms to avoid disruption. It's a G7 ally, with the economic weight and political structure to absorb short-term pressure. By pushing too hard, Trump may risk breaking a relationship that has long benefited both nations. A deal is still possible. But if the U.S. insists on unconditional surrender, Canada may choose to walk. And if that happens, July 21st won't just mark a failed negotiation. It could mark the beginning of something far more costly, the unraveling of North America's most vital trade alliance.
There are hints Canada and the U.S. are moving closer to some kind of deal on trade. Last week, the government confirmed Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has been communicating directly with the U.S. president.
I think, if they're negotiating with each other and talking on a regular basis.
As Washington wraps up a high-profile trade deal framework with China, one that maintains 55% tariffs but secures U.S. access to rare earths, another critical trade relationship is back in focus: Canada. Ottawa and Washington are now quietly advancing their own talks. The key question is whether the U.S. will shift its attention to lowering tariffs on its closest neighbor. This matters, as businesses and consumers on both sides of the border are already feeling the economic pain. Let's take a closer look. According to CBC News and Global News, Canada and the U.S. are actively exchanging draft positions on a potential trade deal. Documents covering tariffs and trade terms have been shared between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Trump. At this stage, both sides are not yet ready to exchange a comprehensive draft agreement. Still, U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Huckstra confirmed that the two leaders have been in frequent direct contact. They are expected to face questions about trade progress when they meet at the G7 summit in Alberta. While Huckstra would not predict an imminent deal, he described the tone and direction of talks as positive. In short, a deal is not done yet, but momentum is building.
Aluminum to Arctic security to that Golden Dome. What's on a private document passed back and forth between Ottawa and Washington?
Both governments have strong reasons to reach an agreement. For Canada, Trump's tariffs have already caused damage. The U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, leading to job losses. The Canadian Steel Producers Association reports that more than 700 steel jobs in Canada have been lost, with thousands more at risk. The tensions are also hurting American businesses. Canadian tourism to the U.S. has dropped sharply. According to statistics, Canada, car travel to the U.S. fell 38% in May 2025 compared to a year earlier. Air travel fell 24%. The U.S. Travel Association estimates that every 10% drop in Canadian tourism costs the U.S. about $2.1 billion and roughly 14,000 jobs. With tourism down over 20%, the financial hit is already substantial. Air Canada reported double-digit declines in U.S.-bound bookings, and U.S. carriers like United have cut capacity on Canadian routes. The growing economic costs on both sides now make a resolution more urgent than ever.
For a while now that I think critical minerals is one of the things that will unlock what the Prime Minister has said is a new relationship with the United States.
As U.S. industries face supply chain vulnerabilities, Canada's position at the table has never been stronger. Critical minerals are a key example. Canada is already the largest single-country supplier of minerals to the United States. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Canada provides 90% of U.S. potash imports, 50% of aluminum, 30% of uranium, 25% of steel, and key rare earth elements such as germanium and gallium. These materials are essential for semiconductors, clean energy, and defense. CSIS analyst Chris Hernandez-Roy described critical minerals as one of the strongest cards Canada can play in the talks. A recent example illustrates this urgency. In May 2025, Ford temporarily shut down its Chicago plant for a week due to rare earth shortages. While this was tied to global supply issues, Canada's stable, trusted supply gives it leverage. Canada is also scaling up production. Saskatchewan's new rare earth refinery, built by the Saskatchewan Research Council, is now producing materials for U.S. defense contractors, helping Washington reduce dependence on less reliable sources. Now that the U.S. has secured a trade framework with China, will Trump prioritize resolving tensions with Canada? The economic pressures are clear. Businesses are struggling. Consumers are paying more. Both economies need relief. Although a full agreement at the G7 is unlikely, the trade talks are moving forward. With Canada's critical leverage and mounting economic costs, progress is not just possible, it is increasingly necessary.